Jasmine Washington watches in shock as the arrogant white pilot deliberately tosses her ID into the plane's trash compactor. The terminal goes silent as she pulls out her FBI director badge. His face drains of color as security cameras capture everything. "This isn't over," she whispers. "Before we dive into this shocking story, let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button if you've ever witnessed discrimination, and subscribe to hear more stories of justice being served." Now let's find out what happened before this explosive confrontation. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Jasmine Washington's Georgetown brownstone as she meticulously packed her carry-on luggage. At 43, Jasmine had made history as the first black female FBI director in the Bureau's existence, a position she'd held for just under 2 years. Today's flight to Detroit wasn't a routine trip, it marked a critical juncture in her career. "You sure you don't want me to come with you?" asked Raymond, her husband of 15 years, leaning against the doorframe of their bedroom. At 45, Raymond's salt and pepper beard framed a face that had weathered many storms alongside his wife. "This one's too sensitive," Jasmine replied, zipping her luggage closed. "The airline corruption case has racial discrimination patterns that go deeper than we initially thought. If we're right, this could implicate executives at multiple carriers." She paused, checking her reflection in the mirror. The tailored navy pantsuit projected authority, but Jasmine knew from experience that her appearance would still be scrutinized in ways her white male predecessors never experienced. Every hair had to be perfect, every wrinkle smoothed, the unspoken tax of being both black and female in a position of power. 20 years in the Bureau, and some days it still feels like day one, she murmured, adjusting her blazer. Raymond crossed the room and placed his hands gently on her shoulders. "That's because you're still fighting the same battles. Different title, same war." Jasmine nodded, remembering her journey through the ranks, the whispers that she was an affirmative action hire, despite graduating top of her class at Harvard Law, the constant need to prove herself twice as competent as her colleagues, the senior agent who told her point-blank that women like her didn't become directors. "At least now I can do something about it," she said, turning to face Raymond. The drive to Reagan National Airport was filled with Raymond's attempts to lighten the mood with stories about his high school history students, but Jasmine's mind kept returning to the case files. The investigation had uncovered disturbing patterns. Minority passengers subjected to random security checks at rates far exceeding statistical probability, qualified minority candidates mysteriously failing final interviews for pilot positions, and internal communications suggesting coordinated efforts to maintain the status quo. "Just promise me you'll stay safe," Raymond said as they pulled up to the departure's curb. "You're making powerful enemies." Jasmine kissed him goodbye. "I always do." Inside the terminal, Jasmine noticed the subtle signs that had become all too familiar throughout her life, the way security personnel's eyes lingered on her a beat longer than on white travelers, how the customer service agent's smile tightened almost imperceptibly when she approached, the white businessman who cut in front of her in the priority boarding line as if she couldn't possibly belong there. Scanning her surroundings with professional awareness, she observed how the gate agents processed passengers. White travelers moved through with cursory ID checks while others faced additional scrutiny. It wasn't blatant enough to trigger complaints, just persistent enough to create different realities for different passengers. Her phone vibrated with an urgent call from Deputy Director Lawrence Hayes. "Director Washington, we've had a breakthrough," Hayes said without preamble. One of the whistleblowers provided documentation linking Chief Pilot Brandon Reynolds to the discriminatory hiring practices. "He's currently working Flight 1372 to Detroit, your flight." Jasmine's pulse quickened. "The same Reynolds from the internal emails?" "The very same. He doesn't know we're onto him yet. This could be an opportunity to observe without tipping our hand." "I'll keep my eyes open," Jasmine promised, ending the call as the boarding announcement for first-class passengers echoed through the terminal. The stakes had just gotten higher. Not only was she investigating industry-wide corruption, but she would now be face-to-face with one of the key suspects. As she gathered her belongings and moved toward Gate B-17, Jasmine felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, responsibility not just to the case, but to every person who had faced discrimination without having the authority to fight back. Gate B-17 buzzed with pre-boarding activity as Jasmine approached the priority lane. Unlike most flights where gate agents checked boarding passes, this one featured the chief pilot himself, Brandon Reynolds, a 54-year-old white man with steel-gray hair and the confident posture of someone who had never questioned his right to authority. Reynolds stood with his hands behind his back, a practiced smile appearing and disappearing as he greeted passengers. Jasmine noticed immediately how his demeanor shifted depending on who stood before him. For the white executives in business attire, there were warm handshakes and casual questions about their destinations. For others, his interactions were perfunctory at best. First time in first class? Reynolds asked a young Asian man who had just presented his boarding pass, the condescension barely concealed in his tone. Jasmine observed carefully, mentally cataloging each interaction as the line moved forward. 3 passengers ahead of her, an elderly white couple received Reynolds' most charming smile. "Mr. and Mrs. Davidson. Wonderful to see you again. How was Scottsdale?" When it was finally Jasmine's turn, the transformation was immediate and stark. Reynolds' smile vanished, replaced by a tight-lipped assessment that lingered uncomfortably on her face before dropping to her blazer and tailored pants. "Boarding pass and ID," he said flatly, extending his hand without making eye contact. Jasmine presented her credentials, noting how Reynolds' inspection of her documentation was noticeably more thorough than it had been for previous passengers. He flipped her government-issued ID back and forth, holding it up to the light in a show of suspicion that hadn't been applied to anyone else. "This doesn't look right," he muttered, squinting at her ID. "The hologram seems off." "I assure you, it's authentic," Jasmine replied evenly, maintaining her composure despite the obvious differential treatment. Reynolds' eyes narrowed. "You'd be surprised how many good fakes we see these days. Especially with certain demographics trying to access privileges they haven't earned." The implication hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Behind her, the line had grown, with several passengers shifting uncomfortably as they witnessed the exchange. One woman in line, a middle-aged white lady in a floral dress, looked down at her phone, pretending not to notice. Another passenger, a young black man in a business suit, watched with a knowing expression that spoke volumes about shared experiences. "Is there a problem?" Jasmine asked, her voice calm but firm. "I'm just doing my job, ma'am," Reynolds replied, emphasizing "ma'am" in a way that stripped the word of respect. "Security is my priority. I need to be sure everyone on my aircraft belongs there." A flight attendant approached, Melanie Adams, according to her nameplate. In her early 30s with an elegant composure, she seemed to sense the tension unfolding. "Is everything all right, Captain Reynolds?" she asked, glancing between him and Jasmine. "Just a routine security check," Reynolds replied without looking at her. To Jasmine, he added, "So what brings an affirmative action hire like yourself to first class today? Business or pleasure?" The racial undertone was unmistakable. Several passengers audibly gasped. Melanie's professional smile faltered for a moment, her eyes widening in disbelief. "I'm traveling on government business," Jasmine stated, maintaining her dignity despite the burning anger building inside her. She reached into her bag and produced additional credentials. Still not revealing her FBI status, but providing more than enough proof of her identity and authority to travel. Reynolds barely glanced at the additional documentation. "Government, huh? Lot of bloat in those departments these days. Hiring quotas and all that." Melanie stepped forward slightly. "Captain, perhaps I could." "I've got this handled, Adams," Reynolds cut her off sharply. He turned back to Jasmine with a look of dismissal. "You know, a first-class ticket doesn't automatically make someone first class." With each passing moment, more passengers had stopped to witness the confrontation. Cell phones were discreetly raised, recording the increasingly blatant discrimination playing out at Gate B-17. Jasmine remained poised, years of FBI training helping her maintain control even as Reynolds continued his unprofessional scrutiny. Do you have a supervisor I could speak with? Jasmine finally asked. Reynolds' mouth curved into a smirk. I am the supervisor, Ms. Washington. Chief pilot trumps everyone else on this aircraft. That's something you might want to learn about authority and chain of command. The situation had escalated beyond simple rudeness into clear harassment, but Jasmine knew that reacting emotionally would only reinforce the stereotypes Reynolds was clearly operating under. Instead, she stood tall, shoulders back, meeting his gaze with unwavering composure. I understand chain of command quite well, Captain Reynolds, she replied, her voice steady. Perhaps better than you realize. Let me take another look at that ID, Reynolds demanded, holding out his hand with exaggerated impatience. The line behind Jasmine had grown substantially, with more passengers watching the confrontation unfold. Jasmine handed over her government ID once more, aware that Reynolds was creating a spectacle. His earlier comments had made his prejudice clear, but now his actions were crossing into territory that would be difficult to explain away as security protocol. Reynolds held the ID under the boarding pass scanner light, turning it over repeatedly. This looks suspicious to me. The hologram isn't refracting light properly. That's a secure government credential with multiple authentication features, Jasmine explained calmly. If you're having trouble verifying it, perhaps another staff member could assist. Are you telling me how to do my job? Reynolds' voice rose slightly, drawing even more attention. 25 years as a pilot, and suddenly everyone thinks they know better than I do. Flight manager Kevin Powell approached, his concerned expression suggesting he recognized the situation was spiraling. At 41, Powell carried himself with the cautious demeanor of middle management, someone who wanted to resolve conflicts without creating waves. Is there an issue, Captain Reynolds? Powell asked quietly. Reynolds straightened his posture, clearly pleased to have an audience for his authority. This passenger's ID appears suspicious. I'm conducting additional verification as per security protocols. Powell glanced at Jasmine, then back at the growing line of impatient passengers. Perhaps we could continue this process without delaying boarding. I'd be happy to assist with verification while you continue checking other passengers. I make the security decisions for my aircraft, Reynolds snapped. And I'm not comfortable with this ID. Jasmine maintained her professional demeanor. Mr. Powell, I've provided multiple forms of government identification. I'm traveling on official business that requires me to be in Detroit this afternoon. Reynolds' expression darkened. Government business? What kind exactly? Your professional appearance doesn't exactly inspire confidence. The comment was loaded with implications about how a professional black woman should look, another microaggression in a mounting series. Several passengers murmured in disapproval. One woman in line audibly said, "That's not right," while a businessman nearby shook his head in disgust. My appearance is irrelevant to my credentials, Jasmine stated firmly. Well, let me take a closer look at these credentials, Reynolds replied with exaggerated air quotes. As he made a show of re-inspecting her ID, his fingers suddenly loosened. The ID card slipped from his grasp, landing on the floor by his feet. Oops, he said without a hint of sincerity. Instead of picking it up, he deliberately stepped forward, his shoe nudging the ID card several feet away, closer to the wall where the gate's trash compactor was located. The crowd gasped collectively. This was no accident, it was a deliberate show of disrespect. Sir, that was completely inappropriate, said a male passenger who had been watching the scene unfold. Reynolds ignored him, walking slowly toward where the ID had slid. My apologies, he said with transparent insincerity. Accidents happen. He bent down, picked up the ID, and made a show of wiping it against his uniform sleeve. A bit dirty now, I'm afraid. Captain Reynolds, Powell intervened more forcefully, this is security protocol, Reynolds interrupted, moving toward the trash compactor mounted on the wall. When identification appears suspicious or potentially fraudulent, we're required to confiscate it. Before anyone could react, Reynolds pushed a button on the wall unit and fed Jasmine's government ID into the slot. The mechanical whir of the compactor filled the stunned silence of the gate area. For security purposes, of course, he added with a thin smile. Can't have unauthorized persons attempting to board with fraudulent identification. You're welcome to speak with TSA about retrieving proper documentation, though that will certainly mean missing today's flight. The terminal erupted in shocked exclamations. Passengers who had been recording the encounter looked at each other in disbelief. Melanie, the flight attendant, stepped forward with a hand over her mouth. Powell looked horrified. "Captain, that was completely out of line. You can't just." "I can and I did," Reynolds cut him off. "Security of this aircraft is my responsibility, and I've determined this passenger was attempting to board with suspicious identification." He turned to Jasmine with barely concealed triumph. "Now, if you'll step aside so legitimate passengers can board." As chaos erupted at Gate B-17, Airport Security Officer Troy Bennett pushed through the crowd of shocked onlookers. At 38, the broad-shouldered former Marine moved with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to defusing volatile situations. "What's going on here?" Bennett demanded, his gaze sweeping between Reynolds and Jasmine. Reynolds straightened his uniform jacket, clearly relieved at the arrival of security. "Officer, I need this woman removed from the gate area. She attempted to board with fraudulent identification and became belligerent when confronted." Bennett turned to Jasmine, who stood remarkably composed despite the outrageous accusation. "Ma'am, I'll need you to step aside for questioning." "This passenger was causing a disturbance," Reynolds continued, his voice carrying for the benefit of onlookers. "As chief pilot, I determined she presented a security risk and acted accordingly." Whispers rippled through the crowd. Several passengers protested, trying to explain what they'd witnessed, but Reynolds raised his voice over theirs. "Officer Bennett, I need her removed immediately so we can continue boarding." Jasmine hadn't moved, hadn't raised her voice, hadn't shown any outward sign of the rage that must have been coursing through her. Instead, with deliberate slowness that commanded attention, she reached into the inner pocket of her impeccably tailored blazer. "Captain Reynolds," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent gate area, "perhaps this will clarify matters." From her pocket, she withdrew a badge case and flipped it open in one smooth motion. The gold shield of the Federal Bureau of Investigation caught the terminal lights, but it wasn't just any FBI badge. Below it, clearly visible to everyone nearby, were the words, "Director, Federal Bureau of Investigation." A collective gasp swept through the terminal. Cell phones rose higher to capture the moment. Reynolds' face, previously flushed with self-righteous authority, drained of color so rapidly he seemed to age years in seconds. I don't understand," he stammered, his confident demeanor evaporating. Officer Bennett recognized her immediately, his posture shifting to attention. "Director Washington," he said, his tone transformed to one of respect. He spoke into his radio, "Central, this is Bennett at B-17. I need a supervisor and backup immediately. Priority situation." Melanie, the flight attendant who had witnessed everything, stared wide-eyed between Jasmine and the now pale Reynolds. You're the FBI director." The power dynamic had reversed in an instant. Reynolds took a stumbling step backward, bumping into the counter. "There's been a misunderstanding," he began, his voice noticeably higher. "I was simply following protocol for suspicious." "The protocol," Jasmine interrupted calmly, "for questioning identification is to call a supervisor and verify through proper channels. Not to destroy government property, which is a federal offense." She glanced up at the security cameras mounted above the gate. "Especially when the entire incident is recorded from multiple angles." Airport Manager Patricia Rivera rushed into the scene, already briefed through radio communications. "Director Washington, I can't express how deeply sorry we are for this incident. We have a private room available immediately, and I've contacted airline leadership." Reynolds made one more desperate attempt. "This is ridiculous. How was I supposed to know who she was?" She should have identified herself sooner instead of creating this situation. The crowd's murmurs turned hostile toward Reynolds. Someone called out, "She shouldn't have to be the FBI director to be treated with respect." Jasmine turned to face the gathered passengers, many still recording. "This incident isn't about my position. It's about systemic behavior that affects countless travelers every day who don't have badges to protect them. Have you ever witnessed discrimination that made your blood boil? Comment number 1 if you believe Captain Reynolds should be fired immediately for his actions. Hit like if you've experienced or witnessed similar treatment while traveling. And make sure you're subscribed to see what happens next in this explosive confrontation. What do you think will happen to Captain Reynolds now that he's targeted the FBI director? Will Jasmine use her position to seek personal revenge, or is there something bigger at stake? Let's find out as this shocking story continues. Within minutes of Jasmine revealing her identity, Gate B-17 transformed from a routine boarding area into the epicenter of an unfolding crisis. Airport security had established a perimeter, diverting other passengers to neighboring gates while still maintaining visibility of the scene that had captivated dozens of recording smartphones. Brandon Reynolds stood isolated near the counter, his previously commanding presence now diminished. 2 security officers flanked him discreetly, not quite detaining him, but clearly preventing any attempt to leave. His complexion remained ashen, eyes darting between the exit, the security cameras above, and the growing number of airline officials rushing toward the gate. Patricia Rivera, the airport manager, guided Jasmine toward the exclusive airport lounge area. "Director Washington, we've prepared the executive conference room for your privacy. Airline CEO Thomas Wallace has been notified and is arranging transportation to Detroit for you." "I appreciate that, Ms. Rivera, but I'll need access to security footage first," Jasmine replied, her professional demeanor fully restored now that the immediate confrontation had ended. Inside the lounge, airport staff had hurriedly converted the space into an impromptu command center. Within 15 minutes, a team of 4 FBI agents arrived, led by Special Agent Marcus Turner, who headed the Detroit field office. "Director Washington," Turner greeted her with professional concern. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Marcus," she assured him. "But I need you to secure all video footage immediately. Multiple cameras, multiple angles. I want passenger statements too, as many as we can get before they board alternative flights." Turner nodded, dispatching agents to coordinate with airport security. "We've got agents reviewing Reynolds' personnel file as we speak. Preliminary information suggests this isn't his first incident, just the first time he picked the wrong target." Jasmine's phone buzzed with an incoming call from Deputy Director Hayes. "Lawrence, I need you to expand our airline investigation. The discrimination angle just got personal confirmation." "Already on it," Hayes replied. "Wallace is in full damage control mode. He's offering private transportation, compensation, public apology, whatever you want." "What I want is evidence," Jasmine stated firmly. "Tell Wallace I expect full cooperation with our investigation, not special treatment for myself." Outside the lounge, the situation was escalating from an isolated incident to a full-blown crisis. Social media was erupting with partial videos of the confrontation, most capturing the moment Reynolds destroyed her ID and her subsequent revelation. #FBI Director and #Airline Racism were trending nationally within 30 minutes. Reynolds had been removed from the flight roster immediately, with the airline announcing a pilot reassignment due to unforeseen circumstances. Passengers received notifications of a 30-minute delay as a replacement captain was secured. Thomas Wallace, the 62-year-old CEO of Atlantic Airways, was 30,000 feet above Pennsylvania when his private jet changed course for an emergency landing in Washington. His crisis team had assembled virtually, with legal counsel, PR executives, and board members joining an emergency conference call. "This is beyond a PR disaster," the airline's chief counsel explained as Wallace listened grimly. "Reynolds destroyed federal identification belonging to the FBI director while making discriminatory comments. We're looking at potential criminal charges, civil rights violations, and massive liability. The PR director interjected, "Social media is exploding. We need to get ahead of this with a statement condemning Reynolds' actions and distancing the airline from his behavior." Wallace rubbed his temples. Do we have any history with Reynolds that could make this worse? The uncomfortable silence that followed told him everything he needed to know. Back at the airport, Reynolds had been moved to a private security office where he sat attempting to contact various colleagues and friends in management positions. His calls went largely unanswered as word spread throughout the airline community. "This is Brandon Reynolds," he said to his attorney's voicemail, his voice tight with panic. "I need representation immediately. There's been a misunderstanding at the airport involving the FBI director. Call me back as soon as possible." Meanwhile, Jasmine reviewed the security footage with her team. The high-definition cameras had captured every moment of the encounter from multiple angles, providing irrefutable evidence of Reynolds' deliberate actions and discriminatory comments. "Director, we've identified 3 previous complaints filed against Reynolds by minority passengers in the last 18 months, Agent Turner reported. All were dismissed after internal review." Jasmine nodded, unsurprised. "And the reviewers?" "All direct reports or close associates of Reynolds." As the investigation rapidly expanded, a young black woman approached one of the FBI agents gathering witness statements. She introduced herself as Kimberly Jackson, a former flight attendant who had worked under Reynolds for 2 years. "I need to speak with Director Washington," she insisted. "What happened today, it's part of a pattern. I have documentation." In the executive conference room, Jasmine listened as Jackson described a systemic culture of discrimination that extended far beyond a single pilot's prejudice. She presented emails, schedules, and performance reviews showing how Reynolds and others had systematically undermined minority staff and passengers. "I filed formal complaints 3 times, Jackson explained, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. "Each time, they were buried. When I persisted, I was labeled difficult and eventually pushed out 4 performance issues that hadn't existed before." Thomas Wallace arrived at the airport 2 hours after the incident, escorted immediately to the executive conference room where Jasmine was coordinating the expanding investigation. "Director Washington," Wallace began, his expression grave. "On behalf of Atlantic Airways, I want to extend our deepest apologies for today's inexcusable incident. Captain Reynolds' actions do not reflect our company values, and he has been placed on administrative leave pending termination." Jasmine regarded him steadily. "Mr. Wallace, this isn't about one captain's behavior. This is about a pattern that suggests institutional problems within your airline." Wallace appeared genuinely shocked. "I assure you, we have strict non-discrimination policies and diversity initiatives." "Policies on paper," Jasmine interrupted, "that don't match operational reality. We've already identified multiple complaints that were systematically buried. This investigation is no longer about my experience today, it's about everyone who didn't have a badge to protect them." As evening fell, the situation had evolved far beyond a single discriminatory incident. Atlantic Airways stock had dropped nearly 4% in late trading as news of the FBI investigation spread. Reynolds had been escorted from the airport, his access credentials suspended, while his attorney released a statement claiming the pilot had been following security protocols as he understood them. For Jasmine, the personal humiliation of the morning had transformed into something far more significant, an opportunity to address systemic discrimination that affected countless travelers who would never make headlines. As she finally boarded a private jet to Detroit, she reviewed the case notes that had already grown exponentially in just a few hours. "This isn't over," she murmured, echoing her earlier words to Reynolds, but with a very different meaning now. This was no longer about personal vindication, it was about justice on a much larger scale. By 7 a.m. the following morning, the airport's largest conference room had been transformed into a command center for what the FBI was now calling Operation Clear Skies. 3 whiteboards dominated one wall, covered with names, connections, and timeline details. Computer workstations lined the perimeter, staffed by agents analyzing employee communications, complaint histories, and corporate records. Jasmine stood at the center of this organized chaos, reviewing updates with her team. She had slept barely 4 hours after reaching Detroit, where she conducted her original investigation business before returning to Washington on an early flight. "We've accessed the airline's secure servers," reported cybersecurity specialist Aaron Chen. "Their internal communication system uses enterprise-level encryption, but we've received judicial authorization to access all relevant channels." Agent Turner approached with a tablet displaying a series of complaints filed over the previous 3 years. "Director, we've identified a pattern. 47 formal complaints were filed against Reynolds during this period. 39 came from minority passengers or crew. None resulted in disciplinary action. Who handled these complaints?" Jasmine asked, scanning the data. "That's where it gets interesting," Turner replied. "All complaints were routed through HR Director Gerald Thompson, who sent them to Reynolds' direct supervisor, Harold Freeman." The conference room door opened as Kimberly Jackson arrived, now officially working with the FBI as a witness. Behind her came 3 more former Atlantic Airways employees, 2 flight attendants and a gate agent, all minorities, all with similar stories of discrimination and retaliation. "Ms. Jackson has been invaluable," Agent Turner explained. After word of yesterday's incident spread, these former employees came forward. They've provided documentation showing a consistent pattern of discriminatory behavior that extends beyond Reynolds to what they call the Bold Guard, a network of senior pilots and executives who've been with the airline for 20+ years. Jasmine nodded, turning to address the witnesses. "Your courage in coming forward is commendable. I want to assure you that your experiences will not be dismissed or buried this time." Jackson handed over a USB drive. "I saved everything: emails, schedule changes, performance reviews that contradicted verbal feedback. After I was pushed out, I maintained contact with others who experienced similar treatment. We've been gathering evidence for months, but without someone with authority to listen. Now you have that authority," Jasmine assured her. The investigation team had established a forensic analysis station where they were reviewing the security footage from Gate B-17. The high-definition cameras had captured Reynolds' actions from multiple angles, clearly showing the deliberate nature of his behavior. "We've enhanced the audio," the forensic technician explained, adjusting settings on his equipment. "Listen to this exchange just before he destroyed your ID." The recording played back Reynolds' voice with crystal clarity. "Let's see how important she thinks she is without this." "Premeditated destruction of government property," Turner noted. "And we have him on camera making multiple discriminatory comments." By midday, a more disturbing pattern had emerged. The FBI data analysis team had compiled statistics on random security checks across Atlantic Airways flights over the previous 5 years. The results showed minority passengers were flagged for additional screening at rates far exceeding their representation among travelers. Nearly 8 times more likely than white passengers on flights where Reynolds or his close associates were in command. Melanie Adams, the flight attendant who had witnessed the confrontation, had come forward voluntarily to provide access to employee forums and private messaging channels. "There's a private group called Cockpit Talk," she explained, navigating to a restricted chat forum on her phone. "It's supposedly for professional discussions, but it's become a space where certain pilots and senior crews speak freely about passengers and junior staff." The messages revealed a disturbing culture of casual racism and discrimination. Reynolds and others regularly mocked minority passengers, assigned derogatory nicknames to staff members of color, and discussed ways to make certain passengers uncomfortable enough to fly with someone else next time. Officer Troy Bennett arrived with additional security insights. "We've reviewed security protocols across all airlines operating at this airport," he reported. "Atlantic Airways has implemented what they call enhanced passenger verification that isn't required by TSA or FAA regulations. These enhancements give pilots and senior staff significant discretion in questioning passengers' documentation, creating an infrastructure for discrimination while maintaining plausible deniability," Jasmine observed. "Clever, but not clever enough. Reynolds' phone records, obtained through a rapidly issued warrant, showed a series of panicked calls immediately following the incident, first to Harold Freeman, then to board member William Cartwright, and finally to the airline's general counsel. Text messages revealed his growing desperation. She was just another entitled minority until she pulled out that badge. Need damage control ASAP. The investigation expanded hourly as more employees and passengers came forward. By late afternoon, the FBI had compiled evidence of systematic discrimination affecting hiring practices, promotion decisions, crew assignments, and passenger treatment. The pattern extended far beyond Reynolds to suggest an entrenched culture protected by senior leadership. Brandon Reynolds had retreated to his Virginia home, where news vans had already assembled on the street. His high-profile attorney, James Whitfield, had issued a statement claiming his client was following established security protocols, and that any appearance of discrimination was an unfortunate misunderstanding taken out of context. Behind the scenes, however, Whitfield was already negotiating with federal prosecutors, recognizing the overwhelming evidence against his client. Reynolds' 25-year career was effectively over, regardless of the legal outcome. Thomas Wallace returned to the airport command center late that afternoon, visibly shaken by the rapidly expanding investigation. Director Washington, I've come personally to offer Atlantic Airways full cooperation. We're prepared to provide whatever resources you need. What I need, Mr. Wallace, is an explanation for how this discriminatory culture flourished under your leadership, Jasmine replied. Did you actively enable it, or merely look the other way? Wallace blanched. I assure you, I had no knowledge of. That's difficult to believe, Jasmine interrupted, given the scale of what we've uncovered in less than 24 hours. Either you were complicit or catastrophically negligent in your oversight responsibilities. Neither reflects well on your leadership. As evening approached, Agent Turner presented Jasmine with a document that connected the final dots. We found the link to board member Harold Freeman. He and Reynolds were roommates at the Air Force Academy. Freeman has been quietly blocking diversity initiatives while funding the legal defense of pilots accused of discrimination. Jasmine studied the evidence, the pieces falling into place. This connects directly to our original corruption investigation, the same patterns of systematic discrimination designed to maintain control in the hands of a select few. Reynolds' attorney contacted the FBI at 7:30 p.m., indicating his client might be willing to provide information about broader issues within airline leadership in exchange for consideration during charging decisions. He's looking to cut a deal, Turner observed. Let him sweat overnight, Jasmine decided. Tomorrow we'll see what he's willing to share about his friends in high places. As the command center team prepared to break for the night, Jasmine addressed the assembled agents and witnesses. What happened yesterday wasn't about me. It was about exposing a system that has harmed countless individuals who didn't have badges or authority to protect them. Tomorrow, we start dismantling that system piece by piece. The investigation entered its third day with momentum that surprised even veteran FBI agents. What had begun as a response to a single discriminatory incident had evolved into an extensive probe revealing corruption, systemic discrimination, and abuse of power across multiple levels of airline operations. Agent Turner arrived early with fresh evidence obtained from Reynolds' home computer. Director, we've accessed emails dating back 7 years that reference something called the Altitude Club, appears to be an unofficial network of senior pilots and executives who communicate outside official channels. Jasmine studied the documents, noting the recurring names. Harold Freeman appears in nearly every exchange. Who else is central to this network? Board members William Cartwright and Richard Donovan appear frequently, Turner replied. Also Chief Operations Officer Martin Slater and VP of Personnel Thomas Niles. They refer to themselves as the Old Guard and explicitly discuss maintaining the traditional culture of aviation. The FBI data analysis team had compiled statistical evidence that painted a damning picture. Over the past decade, Atlantic Airways had hired only 11 minority pilots out of 247 total new hires, despite receiving applications from hundreds of qualified minority candidates. The pattern was even more striking for women of color, with only 2 hired in the same period. "They've created a perfect system," explained FBI analyst Sofia Rodriguez. "Minority candidates make it through initial screening based on qualifications, but nearly all fail the final interview stage where subjective, culture fit assessments come into play. Those few who are hired get assigned to less desirable routes with limited advancement opportunities." Flight attendant Melanie Adams had become a crucial witness, providing access to internal communications that would have otherwise remained hidden. "There's an unofficial scoring system," she explained, showing investigators a coded spreadsheet. "Minority crew members get marked for minor infractions that white crew members are never cited for. These marks affect scheduling, route assignments, and promotion opportunities." By mid-morning, the investigation had uncovered something even more disturbing. The FBI tech team had discovered a private server hosting communications between the Altitude Club members and security personnel at multiple airports. "They've been flagging specific passengers for enhanced screening," cybersecurity specialist Chin explained, displaying the data on the command center's main screen. "Primarily minorities in business or first class, especially those who fly frequently. The pattern suggests an intentional effort to discourage these passengers from continuing to fly with Atlantic." Troy Bennett had been conducting his own investigation among airport security staff. Several TSA agents have come forward confirming they received special requests from Atlantic Airways personnel to subject certain passengers to additional screening. They were told these were security concerns, but the patterns don't align with any legitimate security protocols. The evidence trail led directly to board member Harold Freeman, whose digital fingerprints appeared on directives, unofficial policies, and communications orchestrating the discriminatory system. Freeman, a 68-year-old former Air Force colonel, had joined the airline 30 years earlier and risen to become one of its most influential figures. "Freeman appears to be the architect," Turner concluded. "Reynolds and others were the implementers, but Freeman provided the protection, resources, and authority to maintain the system." Jasmine nodded. "This connects directly to our original corruption investigation. The same pattern of using security protocols as cover for discrimination." By early afternoon, Reynolds' attorney had contacted federal prosecutors again, this time with a concrete offer. Reynolds would provide testimony against Freeman and other senior figures in exchange for reduced charges. "He's desperate," Turner observed. "And he should be. We have enough evidence to bring multiple federal charges: destruction of government property, civil rights violations, conspiracy." While the investigation team continued building their case, Atlantic Airways' PR team had launched a massive damage control effort. CEO Thomas Wallace issued a public statement announcing Reynolds' termination, the creation of a diversity and inclusion task force, and an independent audit of the airline's hiring and promotion practices. "Too little, too late," commented Kimberly Jackson as she watched the press conference on a monitor in the command center. "They're scrambling now that they've been exposed, but this culture has been entrenched for decades." The FBI technical team had recovered deleted communications showing how Freeman and his allies had systematically undermined diversity initiatives while publicly claiming to support them. One email from Freeman to Reynolds read, "Let them announce whatever programs they want. We'll smile for the cameras and continue running things our way. The cockpit remains our domain." Reynolds' phone logs revealed a flurry of calls to Freeman immediately after the incident with Jasmine. Forensic analysis of Freeman's phone showed he had subsequently contacted each member of the Altitude Club with a message to maintain silence and follow contingency protocol Gamma. "They have prepared responses for exactly this type of situation," Turner noted. "This isn't ad hoc damage control, it's a systematic approach to protecting discriminatory practices." By late afternoon, FBI agents had executed search warrants on Freeman's home and office, discovering documents dating back 15 years that outlined strategies for maintaining what he called the traditional pilot culture. One particularly damning memo detailed methods for identifying and eliminating diversity candidates who might disrupt established norms. Reynolds' attorney arrived at the command center at 5:30 p.m., requesting a formal interview with federal prosecutors. My client is prepared to provide complete testimony regarding the Altitude Club and Harold Freeman's leadership role, he stated. In exchange, he's seeking consideration during charging and sentencing. As the day's investigation wound down, Jasmine convened her senior team to review the evidence. We've uncovered a conspiracy that goes far beyond individual acts of discrimination, she summarized. This is about a coordinated effort to maintain control over who has access to certain positions and privileges within the airline industry. The implications extended beyond Atlantic Airways to suggest industry-wide problems. Similar patterns had begun to emerge at other airlines as the investigation expanded, revealing what appeared to be informal cooperation between old guard networks across carriers. We're looking at potential RICO charges, noted the federal prosecutor assigned to the case. This isn't just discrimination, it's a criminal conspiracy operating across state lines, using electronic communications to coordinate activities. Jasmine nodded grimly. Tomorrow we take this to the airline's board. They can either cooperate fully with our investigation or face the consequences of obstruction. Either way, this system is coming down. As she reviewed the day's findings, Jasmine thought about all the people who had suffered under this discriminatory system without the authority or platform to fight back. What had begun as a personal confrontation had revealed something far more significant, an opportunity to create lasting change in an industry that had resisted it for decades. This was never just about one pilot, she told her team as they prepared to continue their work the following day. It's about transforming a system that has harmed countless individuals who didn't have the power to stand up for themselves. And that transformation begins now. The Atlantic Airways Emergency Board meeting convened at 9 a.m. in the company's glass-walled executive conference room. The tension was palpable as board members took their seats around the polished mahogany table, their usual confidence notably diminished by the FBI agents positioned discreetly around the perimeter of the room. CEO Thomas Wallace sat at the head of the table, flanked by the company's general counsel and chief communications officer. Harold Freeman occupied his customary seat midway down the table, his normally commanding presence subdued as he whispered urgently to his personal attorney. At precisely 9:05, Jasmine Washington entered, accompanied by Agent Turner and the lead federal prosecutor. The room fell silent as she took the seat opposite Wallace, placing a leather portfolio on the table before her. "Thank you for convening this emergency session," Jasmine began, her voice steady and authoritative. "Over the past 72 hours, the FBI has uncovered evidence of systemic discrimination, corruption, and civil rights violations within Atlantic Airways. Today, you will be presented with this evidence and given an opportunity to cooperate with our investigation." Wallace attempted to regain control of the meeting. "Director Washington, we've already expressed our deepest regret for the incident involving Captain Reynolds. We've terminated his employment and announced a comprehensive review of our policies." "Mr. Wallace," Jasmine interrupted, "this is not about a single incident or a single employee. This is about a coordinated conspiracy that has operated within your airline for over a decade." Agent Turner distributed sealed folders to each board member. "These packets contain a summary of evidence collected thus far. I suggest you review them carefully before deciding how to proceed." As the board members opened their folders, expressions of shock, dismay, and in some cases, thinly veiled panic spread across their faces. The evidence was comprehensive and damning: emails, statistical analyses, testimony from current and former employees, and financial records showing patterns of preferential treatment, discrimination, and cover-ups. Harold Freeman scanned the documents, his face darkening with each page. His attorney placed a restraining hand on his arm as he began to speak, but Freeman shook it off. "This is absurd," Freeman declared. "You've taken routine business decisions and operational matters completely out of context to create a narrative that doesn't exist." Jasmine met his gaze steadily. "Is that your official position, Mr. Freeman?" "Because Brandon Reynolds is currently providing sworn testimony that directly contradicts that statement." The revelation landed like a thunderbolt. Several board members turned to stare at Freeman, whose composure visibly cracked. "Reynolds is trying to save himself," Freeman's attorney interjected. Any testimony he provides should be viewed with extreme skepticism. Perhaps, the federal prosecutor responded, but his testimony is corroborated by extensive documentary evidence, statistical analyses, and statements from 27 current and former employees. Most damning is this. She slid a document across the table toward Freeman, a printed email from his personal account to Reynolds and several other senior pilots, dated just 6 months earlier. The subject line read, "Maintaining Standards and Traditions." Freeman barely glanced at it before his attorney advised him to remain silent. One of the board members, Catherine Chen, spoke up for the first time. "I've served on this board for 3 years. If these allegations are true, why wasn't I aware of them?" "An excellent question," Jasmine replied. "Our investigation indicates that information presented to the board was carefully curated. Several diversity initiatives you approved were systematically undermined behind the scenes." She turned to the display screen where Agent Turner had queued up a series of internal communications. "These messages between Mr. Freeman and operations executives show exactly how your diversity directives were redirected or simply ignored." Chen looked stunned. "I personally championed the minority pilot recruitment program. You're saying it was deliberately sabotaged?" "Not just sabotaged," Jasmine clarified. "Used as cover while the actual practices continued unchanged. On paper, Atlantic Airways embraced diversity. In reality, qualified minority candidates were systematically rejected during the final interview stage for subjective reasons like culture fit or command presence." Wallace attempted to distance himself from the growing scandal. "Director Washington, if these practices occurred, they did so without my knowledge or approval." Jasmine fixed him with a level gaze. "Mr. Wallace, you have been CEO for 8 years. During that time, your airline hired 247 pilots. 11 were minorities. 2 were women of color. The statistical improbability of those numbers occurring without systematic discrimination is astronomical." She opened her portfolio and extracted another document. "This is a memo from your office to HR 4 years ago questioning why a diversity initiative was underperforming. The response you received claimed qualified candidates weren't applying. However," she produced another document, "this internal analysis shows over 200 qualified minority applicants were rejected during that same period." Wallace paled visibly. "I was provided with different information." "Willful blindness is not a defense, Mr. Wallace," the prosecutor stated flatly. "As CEO, you are ultimately responsible for the culture and practices of your organization." Freeman's composure finally shattered. "This is nothing but playing the race card. We maintained standards while everyone else lowered theirs. If certain people couldn't meet those standards, that's not discrimination, it's quality control." His attorney tried again to silence him, but Freeman brushed him off. "Everyone in this industry knows the reality, they're just afraid to say it publicly. Reynolds understands that too, he's just trying to save himself by telling you what you want to hear." Jasmine allowed his outburst to hang in the air for a moment before responding. "Mr. Freeman, are you suggesting that in an industry requiring precise technical skills and extensive training, qualifications mysteriously align with race and gender? That somehow, in defiance of all statistical probability, white males are inherently more qualified to fly aircraft?" Freeman realized his tactical error too late. Several board members were now openly distancing themselves from him, both literally and figuratively. "What we're offering today," Jasmine continued, addressing the full board, "is an opportunity for Atlantic Airways to cooperate fully with our investigation. That means immediate access to all records, proactive identification of discriminatory practices, and accountability for those responsible." Catherine Chen leaned forward. "Speaking for myself, I want complete transparency. If these practices have occurred under our watch, the board has a fiduciary and moral responsibility to address them." Several other board members nodded in agreement, sensing which way the wind was blowing. Freeman made one last desperate attempt. "This is nothing but a political witch hunt. Director Washington had a personal grudge after her encounter with Reynolds and is using her authority to. I'd advise against continuing that line of argument, the prosecutor interrupted. Director Washington recused herself from all charging decisions precisely to avoid any appearance of personal involvement. The evidence stands on its own. As if to punctuate this point, Agent Turner's phone buzzed with an incoming message. After checking it, he leaned over to whisper to Jasmine. She nodded and addressed the board. I've just been informed that Captain Reynolds has completed his initial testimony. He has provided detailed information about what he calls the Altitude Club, an informal network of senior pilots and executives who coordinated efforts to maintain traditional airline culture by systematically excluding minorities from positions of authority. Freeman's attorney placed a hand on his client's arm, this time with enough force to prevent another outburst. The FBI and Department of Justice are prepared to pursue this investigation to its conclusion, Jasmine stated firmly. That includes potential criminal charges against individuals and significant civil penalties against the airline. How cooperative Atlantic Airways chooses to be will factor into those decisions. Wallace exchanged glances with the General Counsel before responding. Atlantic Airways will provide full and complete cooperation. We want to identify any discriminatory practices and address them immediately. A wise decision, Jasmine acknowledged. We'll begin with immediate access to all electronic communications, personnel records, and hiring data for the past 10 years. We'll also require private interviews with all senior executives and board members. As the meeting concluded, Freeman sat in stunned silence, watching as his carefully constructed system crumbled around him. His attorney was already negotiating quietly with the federal prosecutor, recognizing the inevitability of what was coming. Jasmine gathered her materials, satisfied that the confrontation had achieved its purpose. Atlantic Airways would be transformed, not through voluntary initiatives or public relations gestures, but through the systematic dismantling of entrenched discrimination enforced by federal oversight. As she left the conference room, she passed Catherine Chen, who had stepped out to make a call. Director Washington, Chen said quietly, "Thank you for bringing this to light. Some of us have suspected problems but lacked the evidence to act." Jasmine nodded. The true test will be what happens next, not just policy changes, but genuine cultural transformation. I can promise you, Chen replied with determination, this board will never be the same. 3 months after Brandon Reynolds destroyed Jasmine Washington's ID, the landscape of American commercial aviation had undergone a seismic shift. What began as a single discriminatory encounter had catalyzed industry-wide examination and reform, with Atlantic Airways at the epicenter. On a crisp autumn morning, Jasmine stood before the House Transportation Committee, delivering testimony on the final day of congressional hearings examining discrimination in the airline industry. The investigation revealed not isolated incidents, but systematic patterns of discrimination affecting hiring, promotion, and passenger treatment, she explained to the assembled representatives. These practices were not merely tolerated but deliberately structured to maintain exclusive control of key positions and privileges. Congressman James Richardson leaned toward his microphone. Director Washington, could you elaborate on how such practices remained hidden for so long? They operated in plain sight, Jasmine replied, protected by plausible deniability and the silence of those who recognized speaking out would cost them their careers. When complaints were filed, they were routed to the very people responsible for the discrimination, creating a perfect system of self-protection. Across town, Brandon Reynolds exited the federal courthouse after accepting a plea agreement. He had pled guilty to destruction of government property and conspiracy to violate civil rights, receiving a suspended sentence in exchange for his extensive cooperation with prosecutors. His aviation career was permanently over, his pilot's license revoked, his reputation irreparably damaged. Reynolds avoided the reporter's shouted questions as he hurried to a waiting car, a shell of the arrogant man who had once wielded his authority like a weapon. At Atlantic Airways headquarters, newly appointed CEO Catherine Chen was leading a very different kind of meeting than the emergency session 3 months earlier. The boardroom had been reconfigured, with the imposing mahogany table replaced by a more open arrangement designed to encourage collaboration. Our latest hiring statistics show significant progress, Chen informed the reconstituted board, which now included 3 new members with backgrounds in civil rights and organizational culture. 38% of our new pilot trainees come from underrepresented groups, and our retention rates for minority staff have increased by 24%. Melanie Adams, now heading the airline's newly established Office of Inclusion and Accountability, presented the next section of the quarterly report. Her promotion from flight attendant to executive leadership represented the dramatic shift in corporate values. We've implemented comprehensive bias training for all staff, Melanie explained, but more importantly, we've restructured our hiring, evaluation, and promotion systems to eliminate subjective criteria that facilitated discrimination. All decisions are now documented, reviewed by diverse panels, and subject to regular independent audits. In a downtown law office, Kimberly Jackson signed the final papers in a class action settlement that would provide compensation to current and former employees affected by discriminatory practices. The settlement, while significant financially, was perhaps more important for its acknowledgement of past wrongs and commitment to structural changes. It was never about the money, Jackson told reporters gathered outside. It was about recognition, accountability, and ensuring these practices end permanently. Harold Freeman faced a much different fate than his former protege Reynolds. After refusing to cooperate with investigators, Freeman had been indicted on multiple federal charges including conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violations. 3 other board members and executives faced similar charges for their roles in what prosecutors called a coordinated effort to exclude qualified minorities from positions of authority. The Department of Transportation had launched a comprehensive audit of hiring and promotion practices across all major carriers, finding similar patterns of discrimination in varying degrees. The investigation that began with a single incident had exposed industry-wide problems requiring systematic solutions. For Jasmine, the professional triumph came with personal costs. The 3-month investigation had demanded countless hours away from home, straining even her rock-solid marriage. As she pulled into her Georgetown driveway late that evening, she felt the weight of exhaustion from the congressional testimony but also the satisfaction of meaningful accomplishment. Raymond greeted her at the door, wrapping her in a warm embrace. "I watched your testimony. You were magnificent." It felt like closure, Jasmine admitted as they moved to the living room. "Not just for what happened to me, but for everyone who experienced discrimination without having the authority to fight back. You turned a personal humiliation into systemic change," Raymond observed, handing her a glass of wine. "That's what leadership looks like." They settled onto the sofa, the evening news playing quietly in the background. A segment about the airline industry reforms featured a brief clip of Jasmine's testimony followed by interviews with newly hired minority pilots beginning their training at Atlantic Airways. "The real test will be 5 years from now," Jasmine said, watching the screen. "Will these changes stick, or will they revert once the spotlight moves elsewhere? That's why the structural reforms matter more than individual consequences," Raymond replied. "You didn't just remove bad actors, you changed the system that enabled them." 2 weeks later, Jasmine prepared for her first flight since the incident that had triggered the investigation. She had deliberately chosen Atlantic Airways for her trip to a law enforcement conference in Chicago, wanting to observe the operational changes firsthand. The difference was immediately apparent as she moved through the terminal. Gate agents interacted with all passengers with consistent professionalism. Security protocols were applied uniformly. The subtle but unmistakable patterns of differential treatment she had observed for years were noticeably absent. As she approached the jet bridge, she recognized the flight attendant checking boarding passes, Melanie Adams, working a regular shift despite her new executive role. Director Washington, Melanie greeted her with genuine warmth. "I'm glad you're flying with us today. I wanted to see the changes in action," Jasmine explained. "I still work flights twice a month," Melanie said. "It keeps me connected to the day-to-day reality of our operations. Plus, I think it sends an important message about valuing all roles within the company." As Jasmine settled into her first-class seat, she noticed the cockpit door was open during boarding, part of the new transparency initiatives. The captain emerged briefly to greet passengers, and Jasmine was surprised to recognize Troy Bennett, the airport security officer who had responded to the original incident. Bennett spotted her and approached with a respectful nod. "Director Washington. I didn't realize you'd be on this flight." "Officer Bennett, or should I say Captain Bennett now?" He smiled. "I was already in flight school when we met. Finished my training and certification last month. Atlantic's new hiring initiatives accelerated my placement." Before returning to the cockpit, Bennett added, "What happened that day, watching how you handled it, it reinforced my decision to change careers. I wanted to be part of the solution." As the aircraft prepared for departure, the captain's voice came over the intercom, professional and welcoming. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Bennett. On behalf of our entire crew, welcome aboard Atlantic Airways Flight 1372 to Chicago. We're particularly honored today to have with us Federal Bureau of Investigation Director Jasmine Washington. Welcome aboard, Madam Director." Jasmine smiled, recognizing the full-circle moment for what it was, not just personal vindication, but evidence of genuine transformation. The incident that began with humiliation and discrimination had catalyzed changes that would benefit countless travelers and aviation professionals for years to come. As the aircraft lifted smoothly into the sky, Jasmine reflected on how a single confrontation had revealed systemic problems that might otherwise have remained hidden for years. Sometimes, it took one person standing firm in the face of injustice to create the opportunity for change, and the authority to ensure that change actually happened. What would you do if you witnessed discrimination in public? Would you speak up, record the incident, or report it to authorities? Comment below with your thoughts. If this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with others who might find it meaningful. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the most powerful response to injustice is refusing to stay silent, no matter who you are. This story teaches us that systemic discrimination persists because those with power protect it through institutional structures. What appears as isolated incidents often reveals deeper patterns of injustice. When Jasmine confronted discrimination, she didn't just seek personal vindication, she used her position to create lasting change. True justice requires more than punishing individuals, it demands dismantling the systems that enable discrimination. This includes revising hiring practices, creating accountability mechanisms, and fostering cultures where speaking up is valued rather than punished. Change happens when brave individuals refuse to accept injustice, evidence is meticulously gathered, and structural reforms address root causes. Every person has the capacity to challenge discrimination within their sphere of influence. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand firm, document what happens, and persist even when faced with resistance. The most significant changes often begin with a single moment of courage, followed by the determination to transform individual confrontation into collective progress. Have you ever stood up against discrimination? Share your story in the comments. Don't forget to like this video if it inspired you, subscribe for more powerful stories about overcoming injustice, and share with friends who need to hear this message. Thank you for watching, and remember, your voice matters in the fight for equality.